trips around the world, which sounds to me like you get lots of money to travel to interesting places. So yeah, we'll go straight over. I think I've held you up long enough to Greg Groggel.
All right, first I just want to thank everyone for coming. This is kind of a nice forum. Like she said, this is my 365th day chasing the flame, as my project title tells you. I started in where I'm from, Omaha, Nebraska, and I've been moving around every 2 months to former Olympic cities. Beijing is my final city, and I actually get to go home in a week, so this is kind of a nice way to kind of book in the year. So bear with me through this presentation. If you guys have questions, we'll do that at the end. Or interrupt me as we go. It doesn't really matter to me. Anyways, this is what the presentation is going to kind of look at. I'm going to start with background, get through some of the basics of what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, who's paying for it, sort of thing. And then I'm going to kind of get into my argument and kind of some of my findings from this year's worth of research that I've been going through. So like I said, 365 days, 6 Olympic host cities, 2 months each. Started in Omaha, Nebraska. First went to Mexico City, host of the 1968 Summer Olympics, Munich 1972, Sarajevo Winter Olympics 1984, then to Sidney, Seoul, and Beijing. So I'm actually going to go all the way around the world chasing the flame in this project. It's been quite the year. It's hard to even describe and really put into words what it's meant for me. But there are some trends and things that I've noticed along the way, and I can talk about that. I mean, you could give me a subject and say, hey, talk about Sarajevo and the war and what that's meant to them, and I could stand up here for 4 or 5 hours and just ramble, just because it's been non-stop, 24 hours a day basically. It's all whatever I want to do. It's independent, which I can explain a little bit. So this is the Thomas J. Watson Foundation, which is paying me to do this. They gave me a grant at the beginning of the year. They gave it to me actually in full, and they're like, here's $25,000. Go get lost for a year and you can't come back. So actually, I haven't been allowed to return to the U.S. for this entire year. So even I had Christmas, Sarajevo, which was a different experience. I've been, had my birthday in Mexico City. All this, haven't seen my family, friends, all that for a year. And that was kind of the purpose of this. It's to go get lost for a year on your own, see what you learn, come back, report to us, publish some things, try to spread whatever subject you're passionate about. And whatever subject you choose. So I came up with the cities, I came up with a proposal, I came up with what I was going to study and how I was going to do it. And these are some of the questions that I've looked at this year. One is kind of what is the lasting legacy of hosting the Olympic Games? 2 is a host city forever enlightened to Washington, it's newly found? Peace and prosperity, or is it left shell-shocked, wading through debt and cultural exploitation? These questions are really important, especially for all of you here who are living in Beijing and kind of experiencing this transformation as we speak. And it's really fascinating time to be in Beijing. I mean, the other cities I've been to, the other ones, they're all former hosts. So now I've taken everything that I've learned from these cities' experience and applied it to Beijing's, and it's been a really fascinating experience. Last question is kind of, are these effects felt only during the month-long span of the Games? They spend years and years building up to it. You have a month and then the Olympics are over. But what does it mean, 5, 10, 20 years down the road? And that's kind of what I've been able to do. Basically, my perspective is this. I was a spectator at Atlanta, 1996 in Salt Lake City with my family, and that's kind of how I started becoming interested with these, with Olympics and what it meant. At first, I was definitely a fan, kid cheering on the dream team, since I'm from the U.S., getting involved with the issues of, just sport, and you have all these people coming together, flags waving. That was really exciting. And then when I was later in university, I worked for ESPN, which is a global sports television network based from the United States. And I worked as a production assistant with ESPN at Athens and Torino. And it's kind of this experience that really got me interested in this other side. Not only the side of the spectators and the sporting events and the gold medals and all that, but this other side of 12,000, 14,000 members of the media, of the city's experience and what the city's done to plan and prepare, and how is it going to be used afterwards. So that's kind of what happened. I was a production assistant. Basically, I was in charge of taking care of our guests when they're on for interview. So basically all the major, at least American stars from Athens and Torino, kind of deal with, talk with, get to know, and it was a great experience. But my background, my academic background, has kind of also affected how I perceive the Olympics, because it comes down to, it's my perspective. Someone else who maybe was a volunteer is going to have a completely different perspective of what the Olympics are and what the Olympics mean. But my perspective is based on the spectator, the working at the Olympics, and then also my academic background, which is international political economy. So I take that and I use that to look at the Olympics. But otherwise, some of you know, like living here in Beijing, you really have these two sides. Beijing, you have just kind of the one side, which is the Olympics are amazing, the Olympics are good, they're always good. Celebratory kind of praise they just throw upon Olympics. And then you have this other side in the world of academia, which is the Olympics are always bad. It's always the lower ends, the poorest people of society that shoulder the burden, all of these sides. And I'm somewhere in between. I acknowledge that there's some great things about the Olympics, and I acknowledge that there's definitely some problems that they need to overcome and they need to address, especially in this globalized, interconnected world that we're living in now. So basically, also what I've gotten interested in is this idea of Olympic narratives. This was in Torino. I took this picture. I'm not sure if you can read that, but it has a certain opinion of the Olympics that you might not find here in Beijing on the streets. And it was kind of that experience being like, oh, okay, so it means different things for different people. There's members of society that aren't so crazy about the Olympics that I am. And it was kind of that interest to get involved and to hear people's stories that got me interested in this project. So that's what I've been doing this year, is basically talking to different groups. I've been talking to members of media, academia, National Olympic committees, directors of the former facilities, grassroots organizations, basically anyone who will speak with me. I've been trying to talk with to get a good feel of what the Olympics has meant for the city as a whole. So basically my methodology is twofold. On the one hand, I look at the objectives and the promises made by the organizing committee. When they bring the Olympics, they tell their citizens that this is going to bring this, this, and this. But rarely do people go back and look at were these promises made. So that's kind of what I wanted to do, is instead of taking, for instance, like the economic impact that people always talk about and be like, okay, I'm going to take the economic impact and I'm going to measure that across the board. But for some countries, that doesn't play into their formula of why they're wanting to host the games. They're like, we're not doing it for an economic development issue standpoint. We're doing it because we're trying to increase our tourism, or we're trying to increase the, help with maybe the social development of youth or something. So instead of trying to force a formula on these cities, I've taken whatever their objectives and their promises, and I've looked to see if they've met those. And then the second part is these pinnacle issues or watershed moments, which is at each Olympics, you have these issues that have emerged. And in the Olympic Charter, actually, it states that that the Olympics, or this idea of Olympism, solves these issues in society and promotes a more peaceful, prosperous society, which is entirely vague. But it's kind of necessary to see, does the Olympics actually address and solve these societal issues, or does it just solve them for the 2-week span of the Olympics that we might see later? And then this idea of legacy. Legacy is thrown around a lot in the last 5-10 years. It's emerged as an issue. But the way I define legacy is twofold. It's tangible and it's also intangible. So on the one hand, you have this side that's architecture, infrastructure, the money, the buildings, things you can feel, you can see. And for a long time, that was the most important aspect. It was the tangible side that people focused on. But then also, there's this other side, and there's this intangible side. This idea of the production of ideas, the cultural values, the popular memory, and the volunteerism. And that's just as important, sometimes maybe if not more important, for these host cities' experience. So you need to look really at both sides. And also, they flow in between each other. For a while, people thought that you had the tangible legacies, and then it flew to the intangible legacies. You had, say, they build a new arena, and then the community strengthens their ties because they're able to, have recreation together. And that was always kind of assumed. It flowed from tangible to intangible. But now people are understanding that, say, the ideas of volunteers, this intangible volunteerism, that spirit that they gained during the Olympics, you take that, and it actually is flowing back into the tangible, because the skills and the skill set that they achieve from working at the Olympic Games can actually, studies have shown that improves your economy, workers are more productive, all these things. So it moves back and forth. And that's what I've tried to do, is look at all sides to it. So the Olympics as a Cadillac, you're kind of wondering probably, like, why is there a Cadillac? What does it have to mean with anything? And what I've come to understand is that people think that the Olympic Games are like they're like a Cadillac, like a product. Like they want the same input and output, the same like gas mileage, the same warranty. They want all these things, and they want it to always be the same exact thing. They want the governments to promise them something, and they want that return. They want their investment, and they want their return. But that's not how the Olympics are. Like in any, as you all know, there's all these other factors that are going into it. There's local circumstance. There's the competence of your leaders. Basically, that's what Montreal learned, was that people always use Montreal as the excuse. Like, well, look at the Olympics. The Olympic Games are bad. They have a negative impact because look at Montreal. They're still paying for their debt. But you have to say yes, but that's because of the workers' strikes, of the mismanagement, of all these other issues. So that's what I've also tried to do, is the Olympics aren't just one entity. It means something for each city because they do it differently. There's scope and range in their planning of how they execute. There's basic parameters in the Olympic Charter of how you need to organize the games. But otherwise, it all comes down to, the Beijing organizing committee wants to build a bird's nest, instead of just a normal stadium. That's their choice. They're going to pay more, and they're taking a risk, but that's their choice. So there's a lot of leeway inside just hosting the Olympics, and that's an important thing to understand that a lot of people kind of look over. Okay, so the objectives. This is important to understand. Why do cities host the Olympics? What's so important about the Olympic Games, and why do they spend all this money just trying to even host the Olympics? On the one hand, you have some cities do it for urban development and infrastructure, try to improve those areas. Others do it for profit and business oriented. I'm thinking like Los Angeles, Atlanta. So that was basically profit based. Some do it to improve their international relations. If you guys were aware of the recent Winter Olympic bid, Pyeongchang from South Korea, this was a very important part of their bid. It was saying, if we get the Olympics, this will help our reconciliation process with North Korea, and will lead to democracy quicker than it would otherwise. So that was their objective. Tourism and self-promotion, that was an objective for, say, Australia and some of these other hosts. Social welfare, if you know of the London bid, that's something they're really talking about. Is our youth of our country is uninspired. They're out of shape. They're unhealthy, and we're going to use the Olympics to inspire them. So that's their objective. And lastly, you have this idea of the emergence into the global community. And this is combining all those other objectives that are kind of almost all over the place and taking them all in and be like, all right, we want to be a major part of the international global community. And doing so, the only way we're able to do that is by hosting the Olympics. Basically, that's what some countries argue. And this emergence is not just externally within the nations. The nations don't just recognize them and say, okay, so you're into the big boys club now, you can buy yourself a drink or whatever, but it's also internal. It's these citizens of these cities feeling like they belong in the global community. And I think that's something that you'll see in China too as it emerges, and we'll talk about that a little later. But that last one, the emergence into a global community, is by far the most ambitious, because you're trying to do all these other things. You're taking on all these other projects of international relations, tourism, social welfare, elements of all those, and being like, all right, this is our moment. We're going to use this we're taking the Olympics as a stage, and the spotlight will be on us, and this will be our coming out party. And that's what more or less you're seeing here. So this is just a brief graph. It's from Holger Preuss, which is an economist in Germany, and it's just important to see, that the Olympics and how you stage the Olympics is so different based on each city's experience. So what this means is that you have the public share of the money that's being invested in the private share. Down here you have LA, which was almost entirely private funded. Because the government said, this was post Montreal, and being like, no, we don't want our hands in any of that. We don't want the debt. And so the private industry said, fine, we'll do it. And then they, record profits, like hundreds of millions of dollars. But otherwise, the majority of these cities have been in here in the middle with Barcelona, Seoul, Sydney. And I think, at least I argue, that that's kind of where cities are more successful. When you get way up towards Montreal, it's too one-sided. But today, the way things have changed, China's going to be really, they'll be up on that public share side, but still in the middle just because of the sponsors that are set up and the TV deals and the money, the enormous amounts of money that's coming in that way. The International Olympic Committee likes to say, we provide almost $1 billion for each organizing committee, and that's sufficient for hosting the Olympics. And it is technically if you don't want to do all those other objectives. So that's what you have to remember, that it's not just all the city's money, it's the IOC's money coming from rights, it's coming from TV deals, sponsorships, all these other things. So my first stop was Mexico City. I arrived in Mexico City, and at first I was going to focus kind of on issues of displacement. And I was like, all right, I'm going to focus on displacement. I'm going to go see who was kicked out of their home and how these poor people were treated. And I went to the Olympic facilities, Olympic Village, and I started talking to people, and they were built in the middle of fields way outside the city. And this was my first city, so I was like, man, this is going to be a long year. Like, I'm already failing, you know? It's kind of hard to deal with. But then this is me understanding that instead of trying to project things, I just need to take their experience and learn from it as it comes at me, and then bring that into this conversation and narrative about the Olympics. So one of the big deals about Mexico City, if you might remember, it's the Tlatelolco massacre. And about a week before the Olympics, a couple hundred student protesters and workers were killed in kind of a fight with the government troops. They were protesting, and then the troops surrounded the square, and then it led to, there was a fight all night long, but there was no real press at the scene. And the government, the official government tally is that I think like 26 people died, but basically every other press agency in the world at the time put the number like 400 people. So that happened. It was a week before the Olympics, and the common mistake people make is they assume that these people were protesting the Olympics, but that's not it at all, actually. If you notice, the Cultural Olympiad is up there. Mexico knew that they weren't going to turn any heads with their athletics, so they said, we're going to have a year-long Cultural Olympiad, and where that's going to be a showcase of our arts just as much as our athletics. And all those students that were protesting against the government and the corruption of the government also were participating in the Cultural Olympiad. And they had promised not to in any way disrupt the Olympics. But the government was so kind of nervous, so getting antsy about the Olympics coming, the spotlight turning to them, that they really dealt with this just in a horrible manner. And so still today, if you look up in the textbook, there's no mention of this. The government still hasn't there hasn't been really the kind of like board and examination that you might expect. So whenever I'd go around talking to people, and I'd start talking to them, this was the only city that actually spoke the language. They speak Spanish, so it was a little difficult. But I would speak with them, and then I would ask, what about the 1968 Olympics that you remember? And they would be like, they would just automatically jump into this massacre. It was so heartfelt and so meaningful for them that the government, it was such a sign of the government's corruption for so many years that they couldn't even start talking about the Olympics. So this is an incredible lesson. How government handles these issues surrounding before and after, especially with Beijing, is going to really be important on how the community is able to remember the benefits of hosting the Olympics. Also, this idea, the burden of representation in the land of Manana. They were trying to change the international global stereotype about Mexico. And they did that through a number of ways, mostly with their graphical design, their logos, those sort of things. Also, they had really cost-efficient planning, steeped in pragmatism and moderation. And what I found that meant was that you had these stadiums that looked like high school, basically arenas, and then they weren't like centers of worship or anything. It wasn't like that. So people just kind of forgot about them and used them. They were used all the time, but there was not that sense of kind of remembrance that you would expect in an Olympic host city. Munich, 1972. And by the way, these are all my photos from the different facilities. That last one I found, I do a lot of kind of like snooping around, and it's really fun. That's kind of my favorite part of the year. And the last one was found behind the shed at the Olympic Village. I was just kind of exploring, and I wanted to carry it out and take it on the plane with me, but I don't know. Maybe I'll have to return and pick up the sign someday. This is the Olympic Stadium in Munich with their roofs. If anyone have been there, it's gorgeous. It's still gorgeous to this day, and it was built and designed in the 60s. It's a perfect idea of what I call iconic architecture, which is they really made this bold move. They're the local community was really critical of this choice of building these tents. They're all sloping tents of glass panes like this, and it slopes over everything. So there's no walls, there's no roofs, permanent roofs or anything. There's just these sloping glass tents. And at the time, it cost more than a normal roof would. At the time, the public was really upset about this. They thought it was too controversial. They thought it was too modern. They were too, a little nervous about what was happening. If you see the similarities with, the bird's nest here. But what I found is that this stadium became this image, this icon of Munich, and it still is to this day. And for that reason, there's a stronger remembrance of the Munich 1972 Olympics, because you have this gorgeous architecture, this very modern, still to this day, and for that reason, it's become an image. They have something in their mind when they think of those Olympics. It's those tents, those roofs, and that's an interesting aspect that kind of has been brought into this conversation about what it means to host Olympics. Also, really important here is this idea of renovation and post-games leadership, renovation of the venues. They didn't bring in a post-games basically manager until the last year before the Olympics. So basically everything was planned, construction was running, and they brought him in and he was like, I can't do anything with these venues. What am I going to do? And they're like, well, that's your problem, whatever. So after the Olympics, a month after the Olympics, they had to close down a lot of venues and basically renovate them to be able to facilitate any post-Olympic use, and which is an ongoing kind of issue that pops up. This idea of post-Olympic use rather than Olympic use, the two never kind of, they never work together. So afterwards, they're forced to figure out how to use these facilities and how to make them economically viable and also just useful for the community that they're in. But it's probably the most successful park, that's what I would say. If anyone's been there, it's gorgeous. At any time, you can find 30 to 40,000 people on sunny days using this park. That's basically what it is, a park. It used to be a landfill, actually, of all the destruction and debris from World War II, which is interesting. So they took this dump and then created it into this center of recreation. And it's a beautiful thing to see. But it's also kind of this theme in Munich of taking the wreckage of World War II, and that's what they were trying to do. That was their objective. Taking the wreckage from World War II and showing that they're now a democratic, open, free, modern society, and that was why they had hosted the Olympics at the time. But then you had this issue that came up with the Munich massacre. As you all know, you've probably seen the movie. If anyone talks about Munich 1972, it's the Munich massacre. And it's too bad, really, because the reason that the Munich massacre was able to happen, you know how, you know why, you know all those things, but you don't know really how it was able to occur at these Olympics or why it was able to occur at these Olympics. And that's because of lax security. They got a lot of criticism during post this massacre, being like, you didn't do enough to protect the athletes, you didn't do enough to protect the Israeli team, all these things. But the reason that they had lax security, you need to understand, was because they were worried about their about coming across as a police state. So their security guards didn't have guns; they had whistles. They for a while they had dogs, but then at trial events before the Olympics, the press was like, "How could you have dogs? There's these former concentration camps so close. You can't have dogs." So then they got rid of the dogs. So you have to understand the historical context of everything that happens and why it's happening, which is important to know. But Munich really marks the point where the Olympics had emerged as a global power. Because what you had was, it had returned from Latin America for the first time, Mexico City. It had returned from Asia for the first time in Tokyo. And it came to Munich, back to Europe, to its home, being like, we've arrived. Satellite, color TV, everything. That was a really turning point in the Olympic movement. Sarajevo was a strange choice. Originally I was supposed to go to Moscow, but as January and the idea of Moscow kind of approached, I got a little nervous. So I opted for Sarajevo, and it was my favorite city. It's an amazing city if any of you've been there. It's just gorgeous, and unlike any place I've been to, a moderate Muslim society. You can say that about very few cities these days. It's really Europe meets the Middle East, so it's really fascinating. But I chose it because it was the first Winter Olympic site held in a socialist nation. It was really, really important, and then also because of the Bosnian War, as you all know, or maybe don't know, because it's not that well. I mean, at the time, that was part of the issue, is that not enough people knew about it. My very first day in Sarajevo, Mexico, I was just straddled with bureaucracy. It was just unbelievable. I ended up having to bribe the security guards to get into the Olympic Stadium, just because I had to fill out form after form, double check, double stamp. I was just drowning in red tape and bureaucracy. So I ended up just walking up and paying the guards, and they let me in. But here, where was I going with that? I don't know. Okay, but here it was like I walk in and get ready to work my way through the bureaucracy. First day, I go to the Zetra Hall, which is the former skating rink. I go into they have a little Olympic museum. I explain my project to the assistant. She's like, oh, that's amazing. And then she walked me into the director of the museum. He sits me down, gets me a cup of tea, and he says, okay, go ahead with the questions. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. So he's like, okay, it's okay, I'll just tell my story. So this guy, he told me this story of how he was appointed the director of the Olympic Museum in 1991, right when the situation, if you remember, was starting to worsen. And he could feel that in the air. He knew something was happening, something was about to go wrong. So he said to his staff, he's like, all right, this is a perfect time to paint the walls. of the Olympic Museum. So they took down all their artifacts, everything, cleared it out, put it in the basement, and a month later, the Olympic Museum was bombed. And he told me this, and he just is telling me this story, and like tears start rolling down his eyes, and he starts talking about the Bosnian War and what it meant to him, and have to live through that, and have the Olympics. And during the war, you need to understand that the Bosnian Serb forces, they started targeting these ideas of these centers of Bosnian identity. And a big part of that was the Olympic Stadium, the Olympic Museum. Those were some of the first things that were targeted by in their strikes, and first things destroyed. So it was incredibly sad, but you had this guy telling me this is something that he lived through, and now he's rebuilding this Olympic Museum. So it was something to see. It was I mean, this was the judges' stand at the ski jumping, which is still, a lot of it's been reconstructed. There's still a long ways to go. And you can see, this is the Olympic logo for Sarajevo, where that used to be. And then underneath, during the war, it was where the UN forces kept a watch out. And then you see the bullet holes on the side of the building too. And it was just, it was amazing to see. I had to hire, for instance, a guide to take me up to the bobsled track. The bobsled track overlooks the city on this hill. It's probably the most famous little mountain for Sarajevo, really meaningful to them, Trebevic. And it's still destroyed because it's still scattered with landmines completely. So you can't even go up there. Children used to go up there with picnics, everything. You still can't go up there. The reason there's so many landmines there compared to everywhere else is that the bobsled track was used as a natural trench. The sloping walls of the concrete. So it was a trench during the war where they just sat up and they sniped from this bobsled track onto the city. And you walk along. I walked along the bobsled track, and there's all these holes in the bobsled track, and where they'd have their guns pointing out through to see anyone approaching. And it's just amazing. I had to hire a guide, and he was like, "Okay, there's a mine over there if you see it, so don't step over there." And I was like, "Oh my God." Like, he was, it was so casual to him, and I was like, my mom is gonna kill me if she finds out I'm walking around landmines. So it was unlike any other experience, and for that reason, it was really meaningful. But also, what it showed is that this idea of Olympic family and the rebuilding of Sarajevo, the Olympic village that was destroyed, like the whole city was basically destroyed. Olympic village was destroyed. It was repaid. The reconstruction was paid for by Barcelona. So you're like, why did the city of Barcelona pay to rebuild an Olympic village, an apartment complex that was just used to, as middle income, lower income housing? And it was just because they were an Olympic city around the same time as the war. That's the only reason. They had no obligation. They just felt that was something that they needed to do because you had this idea of the Olympic family, and they were now a member of that Olympic family, and they needed to take care of one another. The Zetra Hall, which was the site for the ice skating, was paid for by the IOC, by all these different bodies. The European Union donated a lot of money. You had former athletes that participated in that. Johan Koss of Norway, he started a hospital there. And so it was really interesting to see. People I talked to, that was the main thing they said. They're like, the world forgot about us. But the Olympics and the people from the Olympics, people like Antonio Samaranch, the former president, they were the only reason that we felt that the whole world hadn't abandoned us. So to see that and to hear that coming from these people and what that meant to them. So you have the Olympics, and at Sarajevo in 1984, the Olympics went off great. It was important. They had a good time, built some new facilities, whatever. But then during the war and after the war, it meant so much more to them. So it changed. You didn't even expect it, but 10 years down the line, now they're talking and people are crying about that Olympic experience because it has changed and the meaning of those Olympics has evolved over time. Really interesting to see. So you never know really where your legacy is going to take you unless you know your historical circumstance. Sidney was just a blast. Like any of you from Australia, it's just beautiful and no one ever wants to leave. I mean, it's an amazing city. Anyways, but these are the best ever Olympic Games because these were the only reason because these were Antonio Samaranch, the former president. These were his last Olympics, and he used to say that at every Olympics. He said it at Seoul, he said it at Barcelona, and he didn't say it at Atlanta, which is too bad, which meant even worse to them. And then he said it at Sidney, and then he retired. So the PR department's like, yes, now we have this statement we have to throw around all the time. But now during the Olympics, everyone said that. Press, people had a blast. It was an amazing time. you know, people say it was the best Olympics. Well run, smooth, the infrastructure, great, beautiful facilities. You know, it's a beautiful city as is. But then afterwards, a couple years afterwards, then the media starts turning on these facilities. They're like, oh, they're all white elephants, the dreaded label. They're like, these are white elephants, no one's using them. And so what's Sidney, I started to look back, and I looked farther back to what the public opinion was 5 years before and 2 years before, and then what it's in now. And what I noticed is that it's gone like this. Like, it started out, people were so excited about the Olympics. And then scandal, and then they realized that it was going to be a long 8 years of preparations, and it was going to be a lot to kind of be constantly thrown at you. And then it kind of started to drop off. Public opinion wasn't so crazy about it. They developed this TV show, if any of you have seen it. It's called The Games, and it was basically like the show The Office, you know? But it was The Office based on the organizing committee. So it was just talking about how ineffectual and bizarre the organizing committee is. It's a brilliant, very kind of British humor, and you should check it out if you're interested. Because they have like, there's the meeting where they're trying to decide who's going to light the flame at the opening ceremonies, and someone's suggesting that Australian golfer Greg Norman should hit a flaming golf ball into the torch. There's also the issue where like they realize that their track is 90 meters instead of 100 meters, so they're trying to see if they can get that past everyone. It's really funny, but it's kind of that, you know, that mockery that was needed, and people, you know, there was scandals, and so they used the scandals and they brought it into the show. So things not going very well. And then also you have this idea of the Aboriginal protest that everyone's talking about. They're like, yeah, this is going to be big. This is important for the Australians, Aboriginal Australians. They're going to use the media and the international spotlight to protest. It's going to disrupt everything. Organizers are really worried. So the Olympics happen, everything goes right. They don't protest because some of their most important members of their Aboriginal Australian community are actually athletes. Things run really smoothly, everything, so it's great. Best time ever, like I said afterwards, white elephants, and now it's starting to come back up again. So it's interesting to see how legacy can evolve and change over time. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So this idea of Aboriginal reconciliation, I looked at that when I was there to see if, you know, everyone remembers Kathy Freeman lighting the torch. That's an amazing Olympic moment. But you don't really know if does that really have meaning, or is that just like an NBC television moment? So I kind of went there and I interviewed Aboriginal Australian activists. I interviewed some people with academia, and they're like, no, it had no real meaning. They're like, you know, sports was the only place that Aboriginal Australians were accepted. So it wasn't a surprise to have Kathy Freeman doing what she did. I mean, she was amazing at it, and it was a beautiful moment, but it didn't really change their society. So it's really necessary to go back and look and see how these things are affected. Also, the treatment of the homeless was a major issue in Sydney, because in Atlanta, for those of you who know, basically what the police did is they did these street sweeps. So they went through and they picked up all the homeless people, and they put them in a van or a bus, and they're like, all right, here's a one-way ticket out of town. So they sent them out of town. Sometimes they housed them, sometimes they didn't, and they just cleaned them off the streets. The police actually had citations with black mail already filled in on the citations to give for disorderly conduct in the city. It was just unbelievable what they did, what they pulled during those Olympics. So everyone at Sidney, they wanted to turn their attention to that. And so the press, even, there's some reports that the homeless were treated badly, but I wanted to see really what it was. So I went out and interviewed some homeless people in the city, which was an interesting activity, because you don't really know who's homeless and who is just dresses really poorly or is taking a nap in a park. So I would stand there for a while and look around and be like, all right, I'll go ask him, and then kind of work my way into it. So are you here a lot? But what they said is, they're like, no, they're like, we had no problem. I've been here for 8 years in the same park. I was like, so how did the police treat you? And this one lady was like, yeah, they treated me horribly. I was like, yeah, what happened? What did they do? And she was like, yeah, they stole my beer. And I was like, yeah. He's like, okay. And I was like, yeah. And so like, what did they do that was so bad? She was like, they stole my beer. So it was interesting to see. It was an interesting activity nonetheless. But that's really what you need to do. You can't just take the reports during the Olympic Games as face value. You need to go back 5-10 years afterwards and look at and re-examine these issues to see if that was really the case. Because, you know, Lord knows you can't trust the press. So Seoul, 1988, this idea of internationalization push towards democracy. So as you know, like this was the 70s and even the 80s were a tumultuous time for Seoul and Korea and in their history. In the 70s and in the 80s, they had a military regime, kind of these military dictators that were in charge, more or less. You know, they were working their way. They'd been having to rebuild their country from scratch. And a lot of people I talk to, they're like, yeah, the dictators or these military officers were necessary at the time. We needed to move beyond that stage. But then as the Olympics approached, there was more and more criticism coming in. The international media turns their scope towards Seoul. And then the leaders get worried and they're like, oh no, we need to hold elections. So they actually held elections in the year before the Olympics just to really satisfy that international demand. So push them down the roads of democracy, which a lot of people in the Olympic academia really cite as one of the really positive things the Olympic movement has ever done. Also, this idea of internationalization. A lot of people I talked to, I was like, what was the impact of the Olympics for you? And they use this idea called internationalize. It's internationalized us. Before we were just a part of the world, kind of, or we weren't even a part, we were just a member there. There was these other elites, maybe these other global superpowers, but the Olympics kind of made them feel like now that they belonged, that they were a part of that community. So that was interesting to see. And lastly then, SOSFAO, which is an agency set up to organize, it was an Olympic agency to set up afterwards to govern sports in the city, to develop stadiums, to do all these things. And now they're self-financing, and the government relies on them for money because they've been so successful. By far the most successful sports agency out of any of the ones that I came across. But the reason they do it is because they can generate revenue through various activities, some really interesting ways that I guess I'll talk about later. But that's kind of been the legacy of Seoul. So some of the lessons learned. One, these are the glaring things. There's a lack of legacy planning. There's no doubt about it. There's some great quotes, even as recent as Sidney, of people being like, well, what was I supposed to do? I was trying to plan the world's largest event. Like, well, what was I supposed to do about the years afterwards? I was too busy with my job. But then you realize that the Olympics last for a month, maybe. And these stadiums will be around for maybe 50, 100 years. So what's more important, really? It's going to be that after the time. Even the Olympics, you think that's the most important time. I would argue that it's really that legacy planning that's so crucial to their experience afterwards. So the velodrome, this is kind of one of my favorite things from this year, is so you build all these facilities, and then all of a sudden the Olympics move on, and you're like, what do I do with them? And it's the velodrome which is the cycling events, is kind of the big ones. It's like, what do we do with a velodrome? You know, if like Mexico, like no one rides a bike or is a cyclist, so they didn't know what to do with it. Now it's just like covered in graffiti, and in the inside they play soccer. So it's kind of like, what do you do? In Montreal, interesting enough, I remember when I was growing up in Vermont for a little bit, I would take trips up to this thing called the Biodome, if any of you are Canadians. And it's like a zoo, it's like an indoor zoo. And I always went up there for all these trips, class trips. It was really cool. You know, it's humid, you get inside, you feel like you're in a jungle. And then I learned this year when I was reading through some of the materials that was the velodrome. And afterwards they decided, they're like, all right, we'll build a rainforest inside the cycling stadium. In Seoul, they're like, all right, what do we do? And what they ended up developing was these races. So now, instead of really going to the track in Korea, you go to the velodrome, and you have all these old men sitting outside with their cards and their pencils, and they're marking down the times, and they're betting on all the cycling races, which is a huge source of revenue for SOSFAO. And then also in Munich, for instance, they had to put on a roof, and they turned it into a convention center because they didn't need a velodrome. And when I was there, I think there was everything from like a wine show to an erotic convention, which I didn't go to, which is too bad. I guess might have been a stretch. Also, so like I said, it's not a priority. But basically, what you need to consider is they really need to break the mold. Instead of afterwards being like, okay, we have a velodrome, what do we do now? Why not say, all right, so we're getting this catalyst from the Olympics to build something. We need this. So let's build that and turn it into a velodrome for 2 weeks instead of building a velodrome and turning it into whatever afterwards. That's not even needed. So that's really what they need to do, and it's slowly emerging. Like the idea of temporary facilities. In Sidney, one of the beach volleyball thing was by far the most successful, most popular venue at the Olympics because it was right on the beach. It was right on Bondi Beach, the most beautiful beach there. Really fun. People laying in the sun, drinking beer, watching beach volleyball, girls in bikini. Really good time. So what you need to do is really to go back and be like, all right, so how are we gonna be creative in our planning? In Munich or in Mexico City, they hosted all the weightlifting events in their national theater, in their ballet, where they host all the ballet events. So to do that, that's where you really want to encourage. And to some extent, Beijing is doing that. They have a few temporary sites, which is a good thing. But it's also really important to have to be creative in your planning, to maybe build, like they did in Munich, a swimming hall that has the 10,000 seats temporary. Because who needs a 14,000 capacity swimming hall? That's one of the things that I've come across this year. One big lessons learned. The other one, like I've kind of mentioned throughout this presentation, is evolving legacy. It's dynamic. It's not static. You never know, who knows what the legacy of Beijing is going to be in 5 years, but it's going to be always moving depending on what's going on locally, or what's going on in the historical context. And lastly, what they really need is a master plan to really work your way through that evolve, so it's not so up and down like it is in Sydney. Beforehand, be like, this is what we need, this is how we're going to run the facilities afterwards, this is who's going to run the facilities afterwards, and this is how they're going to be financed, all these issues. And these are some of the major issues that or lessons learned from the year. Some other things. This idea, now I'm going to move kind of into Beijing, so more applicable to you guys. I'm sorry that took so long. So this idea of Olympic reductionism, which is talked about all through kind of Olympic academia. It's you have the Olympics, and then afterwards they're remembered for maybe one or two things. You put on, like Beijing is gonna host the world. They're gonna have, over, I think they said 4 million tickets, all these events, 12,000 athletes, all these things. But inevitably they're gonna be remembered for one or two things. So what are those one or two things gonna be? It's really interesting to guess. A lot of it's luck, as I'll mention later. Mexico City, like I said, that was the massacre in Munich, of course. Seoul, that's Ben Johnson, the Canadian sprinter, which was the drug issue at the time, and that was major. You could also say the South Korean, this elderly man who lit the torch, that was really important too. Atlanta, the idea of commercialism, and they were actually Coca-Cola's Olympics, or so they say. Sidney was really Kathy Freeman and that Aboriginal struggle and reconciliation. Athens was the empty seats. I was at Athens, and I remember walking up to the women's soccer final 5 minutes into the game. USA, I think it was China or Brazil, and walked up and bought a ticket for like 5th, 6th row. And that's because all the Greeks were like, we don't want to watch women play soccer. So that's what people remember. They're like, no one went. A lot of tickets went unsold. That's one of their moments from the Olympics that everyone's going to remember. So really, it's good. It's an interesting exercise to be like, what is it about China that people are going to remember? So I was walking around one day in one of the older hutongs, and I had thank God I had my camera. And this lady, this elderly Chinese lady, you can tell, I think, by her socks how old she is. But so she's walking her dog, and I don't speak Chinese. It's really too bad. But I was like, I get my camera out and I like run after her, and I'm like, can I take a picture of your dog? And she's kind of like, she's like frustrated that like she's getting attention, and I'm like, your poodle is designed to the shape of the Olympic rings. On the other side it says 2008 too, so it's both sides. So I had to grab that. But this picture is just like, how excited are the Chinese? Like, it's really, honestly, what I described to friends back home, it's like febrile levels. Like, it's nuts. You turn on the television, probably a quarter of it's devoted to Olympic preparations, newspaper, same sort of thing. Signs everywhere in the street. You can't go more than 10 minutes without maybe someone mentioning, talking, seeing about it. It's all of that. But so as we're talking about this Beijing, what the Beijing experience is going to be like, it's important to look back at history because it will tell us a lot. The Asian correlation, I guess, which I call it, which I've kind of noticed as it's gone. So you have Tokyo, Seoul, and now Beijing as the capitals of Asia. It's like that's the club here in Asia. It's like these are the most important capitals of Asia now, and they want that Olympics to kind of solidify their place in that. That's why Bangkok has kind of looked at hosting Olympics in the past, and I bet we'll try to in the next 10, 15 years really try to place a solid bid in. But in each of these cases, basically what you had conflict or a war, either internally, externally, whatever, like destroyed their country. They had to rebuild, and then you had growth. So the country's growing economically, developing economic miracles basically in all these cases, which is interesting. Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing, they're developing economically, tons of growth, tons of development, but they have that, and they have this economic might, this economic power in the global community, but they don't have acceptance. They don't have this acceptance of their culture, of their history, the appreciation of these other issues. So what they want is they want the Olympics, not to prove their economic capability, everyone knows that, even now. But what, for instance, the Chinese want to do is use this stage to say, all right, let's educate the world about our history, about our arts, about all these other issues. And so in that case, it's interesting to see. If you'll follow the correlation, keep going, each of these cities then 10, 15 years after have put in bids to host the Winter Olympics. Because first, as this economics grow, people become more wealthy, they host the Summer Olympics. Then as they become even more wealthy and have more money to burn, they start getting involved and interested in winter sports. That's why Tokyo had Nagano and the rest, and Seoul just lost out, it's too bad, to Sochi for the 2014 Winter Olympics. And Beijing, China will sometime soon host the Winter Olympics as well. Beijing's successes, I think, this just got changed when we were uploading. So I think these are some of the things that I've seen and that I compared to other cases along the way, and what I say are really successful. Iconic stadiums, for those of you who've seen the stadiums, they're beautiful. Like the bird's nest, I love it. I think it's great. I know it's pretty controversial, but I think it's beautiful. And just to let you know, I've been trying to land a official tour for some time, and they've been really hesitant to grant me one. They're like, "Are you press?" And I'm like, "Well, not really." And they're like, "Whoa, are you an academic?" And it's like, "No, not really either." And so they've been really hesitant to kind of work with me. But so myself and a friend, I participated in an Olympic forum and conference a week ago, and I had my badge from that said guest. So I just took that one day, and I had my official notebook and camera out and all that, and I just kind of walked past the guy, that's like the security guards, here, they're not too intimidating. So he kind of said something to me and just kept going. And so then we were inside, the Olympic Park. And if we were thinking about bringing hard hats too, to really complete the outfit. And if we had hard hats, we could have gotten inside the venues, all the workers were telling us. But once you're in, you're in. So anyways, I don't recommend breaking the law, but if you want to get a close-up look, maybe, draw a name tag or something like that. So one of the positive things they're doing, iconic stadiums, like I said, they're taking that bold move, and I think it's really going to pay off, rather than Seoul's architecture is really kind of drab, a lot of concrete, really boring, doesn't inspire you anymore. Graphical design, I think is really great, especially with London talking about this idea of logos, as you know, and the kind of controversy that caused. I think Beijing's logo is really nice. It's not too risky, but it's nice compared to like Atlanta, LA, some of these other ones that have no real meaning or reference or significance. Theirs does. Also, the widespread support and the public ownership, I think, is really important. I think they said in a recent study, about 1,000 people here in Beijing, 97% felt like they supported and they had some public ownership of these Olympics. So I think that's really important for the Olympics. Yeah, 97% is amazing. Fulfilling sporting needs of the city. As you know, you can look out one of these windows maybe, and you see Workers' Stadium and Workers' Arena. And if the Olympics hadn't provided that catalyst, which they always do, which is probably their most important function, I'd argue, is providing that catalyst, you'd be sitting in Beijing and you'd have, for arenas and stadiums, two of them that were built in the 50s, more or less. It was time that Beijing really needed to develop. If they want to be a global city like they say they do, it's really time they needed stadiums, arenas, some of these other facilities. Infrastructure improvements, as you all know, since you're living here, Beijing needs the subway lines. It's ridiculous that they have 3. So the Olympics that they're providing 2 or 3, the airport, it all kind of gets grouped into these Olympic projects, even though they say it was going to happen anyways. That's the thing with Olympics. It provides the catalyst, and it expedites these projects that were going to happen maybe sometime, but it gives the politicians the economic power and also the political will just to go out and be like, we're doing these projects now. There's no question, no debate, nothing. So the roads, all of that, especially with China, kind of this trend of having more and more cars on the street. the leadership could have said, we're going to focus on roads and not do public transportation. So it's good to see that that's happening. Role of culture in Beijing's Olympics is really important. As you know, when you talk about venues of Beijing's, I also kind of almost include, the new eggshell, the arts facility, the music facilities there. They're renovating all the temples, all the historical sites, everything. They want everything perfect because it's a presentation of their culture, not just of their sports, not just of the Olympics. And also environmental awareness. It's one of the major, it's one of the official themes, but it's not really, the environment, I'd argue, isn't really a big part about their Olympics. They're doing token gestures, but what it's doing more importantly is educating their citizens about environmental awareness. They're saying, like, we have an issue with smog and pollution. And before, and even now, I don't even think they would have had that conversation. And because of the Olympics, they're having that conversation. These are some of my photographs from the different sites I visited. You have the baseball over there. If any of you have seen the Olympic green that's going up, like, it's amazing. They're basically building an Olympic, they're building this a whole park. You walk in and you see trees planted in lines, big old trees. I was out there once with a translator and I was like, why are you hauling in these giant trees? And like one of the construction workers like, we don't have time. We need big trees now. We can't wait for them to grow. Which is, very, very, I guess, Chinese. But it's going to be a great park once they get. This is all going to be a lake, more or less. They have a lot of work to do, but it'll be really interesting to see. And as you all know, like, Beijing could use a few more green spaces. These are the other facilities. These are the university facilities. I think what they did really importantly was they spread it out. They have their Olympic park, but then they also have these venues that they spread outside of the Olympic park. So it's not just too concentrated with too much to ever use again, but they spread it out into the other facilities so all these universities benefit from getting new arenas, which I think is really interesting. And those two, this one and that one are both university arenas. Advice for Beijing. This is what it comes down to. If I could sit down now with the president of their organizing committee and be like, this is my advice for you. One is address the language deficit. As you know, if you go out in the city and you're walking around and someone comes up to you and speaks English to you, a Chinese person, you know that they're like trying to scam you for money, usually, more or less. And that's going to really be a problem as you have all these tourists. You're going to have tons and tons of tourists here. So how are they going to address really this pretty enormous language deficit? One way that they're trying to do that is with volunteers. I don't know if you've heard, over half a million people volunteered to be a volunteer at the Olympic Games. Over 500,000, and they're only taking like 120 or 30,000. I talked with this girl when I was in Wuhan or down there, and I was talking to this girl, this Chinese girl. She was telling me she wants to study at the University of Wisconsin. Very bright. She was communications major, spoke great English, and she was like, yeah, I applied, but they're not going to take me. I was like, oh my goodness, how would they not take you? But that's the thing. I think that's really going to be their saving grace is their volunteers. It's going to be more, volunteers in Beijing are going to be more than they have for other Olympic cities. This whole force that's going to come in and take over the city and provide the language and all these other things that you don't get really now is going to be enormously important. They haven't considered the post-Olympic use. This isn't just me. I met with some of the professors at the universities, and they were really candid about the criticism. There's no master plan for after the Olympics. So right now they're just building, constantly building up to this. And then post-Olympics, they're going to have to figure out how are they going to make these huge stadiums economically viable, because they don't have the professional teams to support them, or they don't have the leagues right now, so they're going to have to develop those. Also, I think the Chinese, they need to develop a more coherent message. In a study, there was a study that came out, and it said 23% of the population understands the humanistic Olympics concept. They don't really understand. It's kind of a vague, it's a vague message to send. What is the humanistic concept? And that's really a problem if the citizens don't know what they're getting out of these Olympics or what it's really meaning to them. So I think if they could hopefully develop that a little more, that would help. I think they need to become aware of the art of self-deprecation and also be aware of the bored journalist. Because I know, two Olympics, you're there for 3 weeks and you get bored because you're covering the same thing, living in a hotel. And journalists they'll go explore and they'll cover some things that maybe China is a little, not nervous about, but maybe a little embarrassed about. Just kind of, some little criticisms, maybe kind of like the spitting, stuff like that. And it'll all be done in jest. But especially with this Olympics that are seen as China's Olympics, they're really so touchy on a lot of the issues that they're going to have to become used to that and know that it's not taken in any serious way, but just kind of educating the world about Chinese society, the good and the bad. Can't just focus on the good. Also, they need to forget about the medal count. It's starting to become, if they can do that. I've talked with some coaches for some of the really important teams, anonymous, and they've said that they're getting a lot of pressure, being like, okay, you guys are gonna gold medal, right? Like, you guys are gonna win, and these coaches, these foreign coaches, are like, they really don't have a chance at medaling in some of these sports that they are almost assuredly think that they're going to medal in. It's just, developing the sports that came here in China later than everyone else. It's been rapid and very impressive, but they still have a little ways to go. So it'll be interesting to see if they can top the U.S. That'll be huge. That'll be what all the news is about. Also, expect for a post-Olympic depression. It's happened everywhere, every Olympic city. It's documented. You build up for so many years, 8 years, it's all people talk about, and then the show's over, party's over, and people are like, what do we do now? Like, how do we occupy our lives or whatever? So that'll be expected. Just know it's coming. People in Australia, for instance, the people who wore their volunteer uniforms after the Olympics started getting made fun of in public because they're like, the Olympics are over, get over it, sort of thing. And I can see that happening here. Unintended legacies. As I've gone and traveled, I've picked up these little pieces of legacies. And here it's kind of interesting to see, what if someone comes back 5-10 years down the road, like what are going to be the unintended legacies of the Olympics? Those little things. The things like in Mexico, when I was in southern Mexico, and this guy was like, the most important part of the '68 Olympics, and he points to his television. He says satellite TV. It was the first time that we watched satellite TV down in Chiapas. It's things like that. So some of the things that I've just kind of pieced along the way, the cartoon industry. I've been reading how the Olympics and the fuas, the mascots, are developing China's cartoon industry. So it's going to be interesting to see like how that impacts that. Or this, I don't know if you guys caught the piece, I think it was CCTV, about the seeing eye dogs. China's never had seeing eye dogs before. But now because of the Paralympics, they have to train all these seeing eye dogs, and then afterwards they're going to be given to the blind here in China. That's huge. Like, how do you don't have seeing eye dogs, and now the Olympics are going to provide that? Where does that fit into your standard kind of Cadillac idea of the Olympics? Also, the migrant workers, as far as a little more of a negative legacy, it'll be interesting to see what happens with all the migrant laborers that are in the city working on these facilities, and how China is able to address that, or if they just kind of just kick them out. Professional athletic teams, I think they'll really develop that. Improvements in the medical field, they're developing those to get ready for the Olympics, for all the international tourists and teams, and all of that technology will trickle down. But honestly, like, who knows? Who knows what the last legacy will be? And that's kind of, that's what's been fun about my year. I've been going to these cities and said, all right, what's been the legacy? Like, where can I pick up these small pieces of their story? And so I guess that's the end of my talk. It's been a great year. I've had a blast. It's been interesting to study the Olympics and what they mean and what they mean for other people, and understand like what they mean for me. As far as like the years to come, I'm going to go back and hopefully work from Chicago 2016. They're putting in a strong bid.